History doesn't sleep. Welcome to History Speaks, the show where we bring a figure from the past into the present and ask them to make sense of the world we've built. This week was a busy one. 5 stories. Let's run through them quickly. 1. The United States and Israel launched a massive strike on Iran. Supreme Leader Khamenei is dead. 2. Iran has responded by threatening to close the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway that carries about a fifth of the world's oil. If it closes, the economic shockwaves reach everywhere. 3. The US Congress is pushing back. Lawmakers say Trump had no right to launch this war without their approval. 4. The bill for rebuilding Ukraine after 4 years of war has come in, $588 billion, roughly 3 times Ukraine's entire economy. 5. The Winter Paralympics opened in Italy, and yet, across the world, the wars continue. 5 stories. 1 guest. Someone who knows power, war, and the fall of republics from the inside. Our guest this week lived roughly 2,000 years ago, from 100 BC to 44 BC, in ancient Rome. If you had to sum him up in one line, he's the man who ended the Roman Republic. He was a soldier, a politician, and a writer, often all 3 at the same time. He fought for 8 years across what is now France and Belgium, conquered the region the Romans called Gaul, and wrote the whole thing up himself. That book, The Gallic Wars, is still read today. When Rome ordered him to disband his army and come home, he refused. He crossed the Rubicon River with his troops, an act of war against his own country, and won the civil war that followed. He became Rome's dictator. 2 years later, 23 senators stabbed him to death on the floor of the Senate. He was 55. His death didn't save the Republic. It finished it. His name, Caesar, became a title. Kaiser in German, Tsar in Russian. 2,000 years later, we're still using it. What makes him interesting for today's show isn't just what he did. It's how he thought. He was a man who believed that institutions only work when the people inside them choose to respect them. And who knew, better than almost anyone, what happens when they stop. Julius Caesar. Welcome to 2026.
2026. You carry the sum of all human knowledge in your pocket, and you use it to watch strangers eat. No matter. There is news, and news does not wait. Let's begin.
Our first story. The Middle East. On the night of Saturday, February 28th, the United States and Israel launched what they called Operation Epic Fury, a massive coordinated air campaign targeting Iran's military and political leadership. By Sunday morning, the world learned that Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who had ruled Iran for 37 years, was dead. President Trump announced the operation in a video posted to social media in the early hours of Saturday morning. He called it a righteous mission. He warned that if Iran escalated, the United States would respond with a force that has never been seen before. Iran has vowed massive and unprecedented retaliation. Missiles have struck Israel, Dubai, Qatar, Kuwait. The Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil passes, has been threatened with closure. 3 American service members are dead. A US official says the conflict is expected to last weeks, not just days. Julius Caesar, you have fought wars. You have ordered the deaths of men. You have been the instrument of empire. What do you see when you look at this?
I see a man who crossed his Rubicon. You know that story, I presume. On the 12th of January, in the year 49 before your calendar began, I stood at the bank of a small river in northern Italy with my 13th Legion. To cross it with an army was illegal. It was an act of war against my own state. I crossed it anyway. And the moment my sandals touched the far bank, there was no going back. That is what a Rubicon is. Not a river, a threshold, a point of no return. This Trump, he has crossed his Rubicon. And he did it, I note, in the early hours of the morning, from a resort in Florida, via a video on his, social media. In my day, we crossed rivers in person, but I do not mock the act itself. Killing the head of an enemy state is as old as war. I myself benefited greatly from the death of Pompey, though I confess I did not order it, and when his head was brought to me, I wept. Strategically, you understand, it was convenient, but a man of his stature deserved better. Khamenei, 37 years in power. That is longer than I was alive, very nearly. Here is what I know about removing the head of a state. It is, in the short term, spectacularly effective, and in the long term, it is almost never sufficient. When you kill Caesar, and my colleagues in the Senate tried that experiment, Rome does not become a republic again. Rome becomes a civil war. And then, eventually, Rome becomes an empire under someone else. The question is not whether Khamenei is dead. The question is what hatches from his corpse. I have read that an interim council of 3 has already been formed. 3 men sharing supreme power. How very familiar. We called it the Triumvirate. It lasted, perhaps a decade before we were all trying to kill each other. Mr. Trump says the operation will take 4 weeks, perhaps less. I took 8 years to subdue Gaul, and Gaul did not have ballistic missiles. I will say this with care because I mean it precisely. Decapitating an enemy is a tactic. It is not a strategy. A strategy answers the question, what comes after? I hear the tactic. I am still waiting to hear the strategy. One more thing. They tell me Congress, your Senate, is preparing a war powers resolution to demand he seek their approval. Yes, I know something about generals who do not ask the Senate's permission. We will return to that.
Our second story. In response to the strikes, Iran has announced the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway between Iran and Oman through which, on an average day, roughly 17 million barrels of oil flow. The world's busiest shipping routes are disrupting. Maersk, the global shipping giant, has paused all sailings through the Suez Canal's southern approach, rerouting vessels thousands of miles around the Cape of Good Hope. Dubai's airport, the world's busiest international hub, was hit. At least 3 oil tankers in the Gulf have been damaged. Oil markets were already up 19% year-to-date before the weekend. Analysts are now warning of a major supply shock. Caesar, Rome was the greatest logistical empire the ancient world had ever seen. You understood supply chains long before we had a word for them. What does the closure of Hormuz tell you?
It tells me that Iran has studied history. In my Gallic campaigns, I learned one lesson above all others, and it is this. You do not defeat a superior army by meeting it in the field. You defeat it by strangling its lines of supply until it can no longer function. Vercingetorix understood this at Alesia. He burned his own crops. He cut my supply routes. He came close, very close, to making my campaigns impossible. The Strait of Hormuz is the most consequential supply route in the modern world. Iran has placed its hand on the throat of the global economy. This is not a military act. It is a political one. It says, we cannot beat your armies, but we can make the pain of this war reach every nation on earth. Consider the arithmetic. 17 million barrels of oil per day pass through that strait. Your modern economy runs on oil the way Rome ran on grain. Without grain from Egypt, Rome could not function. Without oil from the Gulf, your civilization begins to seize. The Annona, Rome's grain supply office, was, in my view, the most important institution in the Republic. More important than the Senate. Considerably more important than the Senate, as it turns out. A consul could be replaced. If the grain stopped, there were riots within days. Now, the ships divert. They sail around Africa. The Cape of Good Hope, you said? In my day, we called those waters beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Rome never fully mastered them. The journey from the Red Sea to the northern Mediterranean grows by weeks. Weeks mean cost. Cost means prices. Prices mean the poor suffer first. They always suffer first. Here is my strategic assessment, plainly stated. If this conflict lasts more than 3 weeks, the economic pressure will not remain in the Middle East. It will arrive in Washington, in Berlin, in Tokyo, in every city where ordinary people fill their vehicles with fuel and wonder why it costs twice what it did in January. When that happens, the politics of this war change very quickly. Even Trump cannot tweet his way out of $5 gasoline. Or, perhaps I underestimate him.
Our third story, and perhaps the one our guest is most personally qualified to discuss. This week, both chambers of the US Congress are expected to vote on war powers resolutions, measures that would block President Trump from continuing military operations against Iran without congressional approval. The United States Constitution vests the power to declare war in Congress, not the president. Senator Tim Kaine, the lead sponsor of the Senate resolution, called the operation an illegal war. However, even if the resolution passes both chambers, Trump is almost certain to veto it. And the two-thirds supermajority needed to override a veto does not appear to exist. In other words, Congress may vote, but the war continues. Julius Caesar. The last time we spoke of a powerful general ignoring the legal constraints of his government, it was about you. What do you make of this?
Yes, the Senate. We meet again. Let me be precise about something, because I think your historians have been unfair to me on this point. I did not ignore the Senate out of contempt for law. I ignored it because the Senate had become an instrument of faction, of a small group of men protecting their privileges in the name of the Republic, while the Republic itself was dying. I was not wrong about that. They killed me anyway. Now, your situation. Your Constitution, I have read it in the years I have had, is a document I regard with genuine admiration. It is the work of men who had, apparently, read their Roman history rather carefully. They were trying to build something that would not produce a Caesar. And yet, here you are. Here is the structural problem, as I see it. You have a document that says, Congress declares war. You have a world in which wars are decided in minutes, by missiles, by intelligence briefings, by a man in a resort in Florida at 2 in the morning. The speed of modern conflict has outrun the pace of deliberative democracy. This is not a new problem. In Rome, in a genuine military emergency, we had an institution called the dictatorship. A single man granted absolute power for a maximum of 6 months to address the crisis. Cincinnatus, Fabius Maximus. They took the power, used it, and gave it back. Not everyone did. The question you must ask is not whether Trump had the legal authority to strike. That debate is for lawyers. The question is whether the mechanism for restraining executive power, your veto, your Senate, still functions as designed. The resolution passes. He vetoes it. 2/3 to override. It fails. The war continues. The Romans had a phrase, Senatus Populusque Romanus, the Senate and the people of Rome. It was inscribed on the Arch of Titus in Rome. It was inscribed on every legion's standard, on every aqueduct, on every public building. We held it as sacred, until we did not. And then the senators voted, and the votes were counted, and the legion was still on the far side of the Rubicon. I want to be careful here. I am not saying your president is Caesar. I am saying that institutions are only as strong as the willingness of powerful men to be constrained by them. When that willingness erodes, the institutions become theater. Very expensive theater. But theater. But theater. I would ask your senators to consider this. Every norm that yields without consequence makes the next norm cheaper to break. Rome learned this lesson slowly, then all at once.
Our fourth story, a different kind of cost. This past week, a joint assessment by the World Bank, the European Commission, and the United Nations revealed the latest estimate for rebuilding Ukraine after 4 years of war with Russia. The number? $588 billion over the next decade. Nearly 3 times Ukraine's entire annual economic output. Direct damage alone, to housing, transport, energy, has reached over $195 billion. 14% of all housing in the country has been damaged or destroyed. More than 3 million households. The report notes that Ukraine's people are its most critical asset, and that refugee return, veteran reintegration, and women's workforce participation will be as important to recovery as the physical reconstruction. Meanwhile, Russia's own war economy is showing strain. Even regions that have benefited from massive increases in military spending are feeling pressure as sanctions and declining revenues bite. Caesar, you built Rome, literally. Temples, roads, the Julian calendar, administrative reforms. You understood Reconstruction as politics. What do you see in Ukraine's numbers?
588 billion. In my time, the wealth of Gaul, the gold, the slaves, the tribute, funded the transformation of Rome, the temple of Venus Genetrix, the forum of Caesar, the reformed calendar that your world still uses in its essence today. War, if you win it, can be made to pay for civilization, but only if you win it cleanly, only if the territory is yours to rebuild and the population is yours to govern. Ukraine is different. Ukraine is a country that has been damaged but not subdued. Its people have not surrendered. Its government functions. Its soldiers are still fighting. This is not the aftermath of conquest. This is the aftermath of attrition. 3 times GDP in reconstruction cost. I know something about states that owe more than they can produce. In the late Republic, Rome's political crises were very often debt crises in disguise. Men who owed everything had nothing to lose by civil war. Catiline. Milo. Eventually, myself. The danger is not the reconstruction cost itself. The danger is what Ukraine becomes if that cost is not met. A wounded state, indebted, demographically hollowed by its refugees, surrounded by a Russia that has not given up its ambitions, is a state that may, in a decade, become ungovernable. Here is what I find interesting about this report. It speaks of the people as the critical asset. Yes, yes, absolutely. When I completed the Gallic campaigns, my legions were filled with Gauls who had fought against me. I gave them citizenship. I gave them land. I gave them a stake in Rome's future. It was not generosity. It was policy. A population that has something to lose will defend what it has. A population with nothing will burn it down. $588 billion is a very large sum of money. It is also an argument for why the nations that provided Ukraine's weapons should now provide its reconstruction. Because the alternative, a failed, embittered state in the center of Europe, is a problem that does not stay in Europe. History is full of people who paid for the war and refused to pay for the peace. They always regretted it.
Our final story, and perhaps the most quietly devastating. This week, the Winter Paralympics opened in Milan and Cortina, Italy. Under the ancient tradition of the Olympic truce, a custom that began in ancient Greece, in which warring parties agreed to cease hostilities for the duration of the Games, a formal truce is in effect until March 15th. And yet, fighting in the Middle East has intensified. Russian drones continue to strike Ukraine. The Olympic rings fly in Italy while missiles fly over Jerusalem. The Paralympic athletes compete. The ceremonies proceed. The world watches, and simultaneously watches something else. Caesar. You lived in a world that also tried to manage violence with ritual. Gladiatorial games, triumphs, the Pax Romana, symbols of peace in the shadow of empire. What does this moment feel like to you?
It feels familiar. The Olympic truce. The Greeks called it the pause. The Greeks called it the ekacheria, the holding of hands. For the duration of the games, the roads to Olympia were safe. The soldiers lay down their weapons. The athletes traveled unmolested. It worked, sometimes. It worked when the parties to the conflict valued the truce more than the ground they might gain by breaking it. It has always been a voluntary act, maintained entirely by political will and the fear of shame. You say fighting has intensified during the truce. I am not surprised. I am not surprised at all. We Romans were more honest about this than you are. We did not pretend that spectacle was peace. The gladiatorial games, the ludi, were a management tool. Juvenal called it bread and circuses, panem et circenses. Give the people food and entertainment, and they will not ask too many questions about what the Senate is doing. I say this without contempt for the athletes. On the contrary, the soldier who loses his legs in a war that the powerful chose and then competes on the world stage, that person has my complete respect. They are not the bread and circuses. They are the ones being used as bread and circuses. There is a difference. What troubles me about this image, these games in Italy, these missiles in the Middle East, is not the hypocrisy. Hypocrisy is the permanent condition of powerful states. What troubles me is the exhaustion. I look at the world you have built in 2,000 years, and I see extraordinary things. Medicine, architecture, communication, the reduction of absolute poverty across vast swaths of human civilization. And I also see that you have wars on 3 fronts simultaneously. You have nuclear weapons that can end all of this. You have the means and the knowledge to prevent catastrophe, and you keep choosing not to use them. In Rome, we had a temple to Janus, the god of thresholds, of beginnings and endings. The doors of his temple were open in times of war and closed in times of peace. In 800 years of Roman history, those doors were closed only 3 times. I am told the concept of a permanent war footing would have surprised no Roman citizen. It should have. Watch the athletes compete. They have earned that. But do not mistake the ceremony for the substance. The doors of Janus are open. They have been open for a very long time.
Julius Caesar, you have walked through 5 stories from a world 2 millennia removed from your own. And yet, it seems very little has escaped your notice. Before we let you return to wherever it is that history goes, is there anything you'd like to leave with our listeners?
A few things. To those who lead, power is not the same as wisdom. I had both, or believed I did, and still I missed the knife. The men who crossed the Rubicon with me believed in the mission. The men who killed me believed in the Republic. Everyone, in their own mind, was the hero of the story. This should terrify you. To those who do not lead, the majority of your listeners, I suspect, you are not passive observers of history. The crowd that watched Caesar's funeral, the crowd that heard Mark Antony speak over my body, that crowd burned Rome. Not the senators, not the legions, the crowd. You are the crowd. To those who study history, and I hope some of you do not use it as a mirror to confirm what you already believe. Use it as a warning. Every catastrophe in human history was preceded by a period in which intelligent people said, "This time it is different." It is never different. And finally, the Rubicon was not a dramatic river. It was barely a stream. I have been told that scholars still argue about which river it actually was. The most consequential crossing in the history of Western civilization, and no one is quite sure which ditch I crossed. History is like that. The moments that change everything rarely announce themselves as such. Watch carefully. the small river may be closer than you think.
Julius Caesar. 21 centuries and still ahead of the news cycle. That is History Speaks for the week of March 2nd, 2026. Next week, a new voice from across the centuries. Who should it be? Head to our YouTube community tab, our Instagram, or our X account. The link is in the description, and cast your vote. If this episode made you think, share it with someone who would argue with it. That's the point. History Speaks. New episodes every Friday. On YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you listen. Until next week. Alea iacta iest.